You said yes, even though you didn't want to, and you knew at the moment it left your mouth. There was a pause, a fraction of a second, where something inside you pushed back, but it wasn't strong enough. So you smiled, nodded, and agreed. Later, you tried to explain it to yourself. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't want to make it awkward. I'll handle it. But that wasn't the real reason. And you know it. Pause here for a second. Because this kind of moment, this exact kind, is where most people sense something is off. Not dramatically, just a quiet recognition. That didn't feel like a real choice. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Moments like that aren't rare. They're normal. They happen in conversations, in relationships, in the way you react before you've even finished a thought. And most of the time, you don't notice them at all. You think you're in control. But what if you're not? Not in the way you believe. Most people spend their entire lives convinced they're steering. They're not. They're passengers who got very good at describing the view. Let that sit. Because if that's even partially true, it changes everything. Your decisions, your habits, your personality, the version of yourself you think you are. This isn't motivation. This isn't mindset content. This is something far more precise. This is the moment you realize your mind might not be working for you. If you felt a slight resistance just now, that quiet voice saying, "No, I make my own choices," good. Notice it. Don't fight it. Just observe. Because that reaction isn't random. It's protective. The mind doesn't like being questioned, especially about control. It will argue. It will defend itself. It will search for evidence it's in charge, and it will sound convincing. But here's what makes this difficult. That voice isn't fully under your control either. Think about this morning. You woke up, and within minutes, things started happening. You reached for your phone. You fell into your routine. It felt intentional. It felt like you. Research shows something different. The brain begins making decisions before you're aware of them. Not metaphorically, literally. Building on Benjamin Libet's neuroscience research, experiments have demonstrated something unsettling. Your brain initiates action before your conscious mind knows it's going to act. Read that again. The action begins. Then awareness follows. Which means the version of you that feels like it's deciding is often arriving late, and then doing something very interesting. It constructs a story. A clean, confident, logical story about why you made that decision. This is where the illusion becomes powerful. Because it doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like control. Your brain is processing millions of bits of information every second. Patterns, signals, memories, predictions. Your conscious mind handles a tiny fraction of that. Some estimates put it at around 50 bits per second. That gap is where your autopilot lives. Think about the last time you drove somewhere familiar. You left, you arrived, and somewhere in between, you disappeared. Not physically, mentally. You were replaying something, worrying about something that hadn't happened yet. And still, the car got there. That wasn't luck. That was a system so deeply trained, it no longer needs you. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. That same system isn't just driving your car. It's running your reactions, your habits, your emotional responses, the way you speak to yourself when no one's watching. It's why you say things you later regret. It's why you repeat patterns you swore you'd break. It's why someone who knows you well can predict your reaction before you have it. You've automated more of your life than you realize. And most of that automation was installed a long time ago, not by the person you are today, but by an earlier version of you that had different awareness, different fears, different needs. And yet, it's still running the system. So here's the real question. Who's actually in the driver's seat? Your habits, your reactions, your defaults. They didn't appear randomly. They were built, installed, reinforced through repetition, through emotion, through environment. Some helped you survive, and some are now holding you back. But here's where most people get it wrong. They try to change the behavior. They decide, I'm going to be different. For a few days, they are. Then something happens, not dramatic, not obvious, just a slow pull back to the old pattern. They call it failure, weakness, lack of discipline. That's not what it is. What happened is this: a conscious decision ran into an automated system, and the automated system won. Not because you're weak, because it's stronger, faster, and it's been running far longer. A decision that's days old cannot compete with a pattern that's been running for years. This isn't about trying harder. It's about seeing clearly. Because you can't change a system you don't understand, and you won't understand it if you refuse to look at it honestly. That's where we begin. Not with solutions, with something more important. Awareness. The driver's seat feels occupied. It feels like you. But the car has been following a route set a long time ago. The first step is noticing that. Because you can't change direction until you realize you've been following one. In the next section, we go deeper into the autopilot, how it forms, why it takes over, and why your mind doesn't just allow it, but actively defends it. That resistance you felt? We're not done with it. Not even close. Section 2. The autopilot system. You checked your phone this morning. Not because you decided to, because something pulled you there. No pause. No thought. You just did it. And if you're honest, you've done that hundreds of times. Same movement. Same trigger. Same outcome. Here's what most people miss. That wasn't a habit. That was a system running without consulting you. You weren't choosing. You were following something that had already decided. So if something that small can happen without your input, what else is running that you haven't noticed yet? You've driven home and remembered none of it. Your mind was somewhere else entirely. So who was driving? Something was. Something competent, capable, that got you home safely through traffic and turns and stops. Just not the you that was replaying a conversation from earlier, or mentally rehearsing tomorrow, or quietly regretting something you said 3 days ago. That split between the part of you operating a vehicle and the part of you somewhere else entirely is happening all the time. Not just in cars. In every room you enter. Every conversation you have. The brain is, at its core, a prediction machine. Its primary job isn't to experience the world. It's to anticipate it. To build models of what's coming, match incoming data against those models, and act as efficiently as possible, using as little energy as possible. Conscious thought is expensive. It demands focus, attention, working memory. So wherever possible, the brain moves repeated processes out of conscious control and into automatic execution. This is called automaticity, and it shapes your daily life far more than you think. Here's how it works. The first time you do something, drive a new route, navigate a difficult conversation, respond to a particular stress, the brain engages fully. Conscious processing is high. You're paying attention, making real decisions. It takes effort. You feel it. Do that same thing enough times, in similar conditions, and something shifts. The brain recognizes the pattern, builds a more efficient pathway, and hands the behavior off, transferred from the prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberate thought, down into the basal ganglia, a deeper structure that handles habit execution. Once it lands there, it runs differently, faster, with less energy, and without requiring your permission. Studies suggest that between 40 and 50% of your daily behaviors are habitual, triggered automatically, without deliberation. Not occasionally. Every single day, half your life, already decided. And these aren't just small behaviors. They include how you respond to criticism, how you handle uncertainty, what you reach for when you're stressed or bored, how you begin a difficult conversation, how you talk to yourself after a mistake. You've practiced all of these thousands of times. And practice, at the neurological level, means grooves, pathways that are wide, smooth, and fast compared to the effortful paths of anything new. The brain doesn't favor the right behavior. It favors the practiced one. Now here's the part that creates the most discomfort. The brain doesn't just allow the autopilot to run. It protects it. Change feels hard even when you're genuinely motivated. Even when you've decided, with complete sincerity, that things will be different. That's not inertia. That's the brain actively resisting pattern disruption. Familiar patterns, even painful ones, register as safe. Not consciously, but at a deeper level, the brain has learned. This pattern leads to a known outcome. And known outcomes, even bad ones, are preferable to unknown ones. This is why people stay in situations they know aren't working. Why they return to habits they've already broken. Why the same emotional response surfaces in relationship after relationship. It's not weakness. It's a brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the familiar, resist the unknown, run the established route. Think about the last time you tried to build a new habit. You started strong. The intention was real. For a while, it worked. And then, not a dramatic failure, just a day you missed. Then another. Then a slow drift back. Until one morning the new behavior was gone and the old one had quietly returned. You called it failure, lack of follow-through. But look at it clearly. What happened wasn't a character flaw. It was a collision between a new conscious intention, held for days, and an automated system that had been running for years. The new behavior still required conscious energy to execute. And conscious energy is finite. When life got stressful or unpredictable, that energy went elsewhere. The old system didn't need energy. It was already running, so it ran. This is the core failure of willpower-based change. Willpower lives in the conscious layer. Habits operate below it. You're trying to override a deeper system with a surface-level tool. It works until it doesn't. And it always, eventually, doesn't. So what actually creates change? Not motivation, not intention, not even understanding. Though understanding is where we have to start. What changes behavior at the neurological level is repetition and context. The basal ganglia learns through pattern, trigger, routine, reward. Do something repeatedly in response to the same cue, and the brain wires it together. Eventually, the cue alone initiates the routine, no decision required. That's how the old pattern got built, and it's the only way a new one replaces it. The goal isn't to fight the autopilot. The goal is to understand how it works, and use that understanding to deliberately install something better. That's not a small thing. That is the entire game. Before the next section, pick one thing you did today that you didn't consciously decide. Something small, the way you responded to a message, what you reached for first, how you reacted to something that annoyed you. Just notice it. Don't judge it. See it for what it is, a system running on a pattern built somewhere in your past. You don't have to change it yet. You just have to see it. Because that act of seeing, quiet, honest, without defense, is the first real interruption. Section 3, where your thoughts come from. The opinion you're most certain about. Where did you actually get it? Not the surface answer. Not, I believe this because of X, or I've always thought this. Go further back. Before the certainty. Before it felt like yours. Because here's what's true, and what almost nobody pauses long enough to examine. The vast majority of what you call your perspective was handed to you, before you had the capacity to evaluate it, before you could consent to it, before you even knew that accepting it was something you were doing. You didn't build your worldview from scratch. You inherited it. And then, over time, you forgot that part. This isn't an accusation. It's a developmental fact. The human brain, particularly in the first decade of life, operates in a state of extraordinary receptivity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking and reasoned judgment, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. In childhood, the brain is absorbing everything, pattern matching at an enormous rate, building models of how the world works, what's safe, what's threatening, what's expected, what's possible. And the primary source of all that data is the environment around you, the adults in your life, the dynamics in your home, what got praised and what got punished, which emotions were welcomed and which ones made the room uncomfortable, what was said about money, about relationships, about success, about people who were different, what was said about you, your potential, your limits, your worth. All of it went in, not filtered, not evaluated, absorbed as fact, as truth, as the way things are. And then it became the operating system. Think about your inner critic. Most people have one. That voice that surfaces when you've made a mistake, or when you're about to try something new, or when you're sitting quietly and it decides to remind you of your inadequacies. Harsh, repetitive, wildly disproportionate to whatever actually happened. Here's the question worth sitting with. Whose voice is that, really? If you listen carefully, not to the content, but to the tone, the cadence, the particular flavor of its criticism, many people find it sounds familiar. Not like them, like someone else. A parent, a teacher, a coach, someone whose words landed hard enough, early enough, that the brain internalized not just the message, but the messenger. You didn't choose that voice. It was installed, and it has been running, largely unexamined ever since. This is what psychologists mean by internalized voices, not metaphor, but an actual cognitive process. Early relational experiences encoded into self-referential thought patterns that operate automatically, as if they were simply the truth about you. And it goes further than the inner critic. Your beliefs about what you deserve, installed. How much space you're allowed to take up, installed. Whether people can fundamentally be trusted, installed. Your relationship with risk, with failure, with success. All of it inherited from a context you didn't choose, absorbed when you couldn't evaluate it, carried forward as though it were simply who you are. The philosopher you never knew you'd become, operating from premises you never consciously agreed to. Here's where it gets more uncomfortable. It's not just childhood. The installation never stops. Every environment you move through is shaping you. The culture you're embedded in tells you what a successful life looks like, what a worthy person looks like, what you should want. The media you consume shapes your threat perception, your emotional baseline, your sense of what's normal. The people you spend the most time with quietly influence your vocabulary, your priorities, your tolerance for certain kinds of thinking. None of this requires your active participation. It happens in the background, through exposure, through repetition, through the brain's constant process of updating its models. You are being shaped, continuously, by inputs you mostly aren't tracking. And the tricky part, the part that makes this so hard to see, is that it doesn't feel like influence from outside. It feels like thinking. It feels like you, arriving at conclusions, being a person with a perspective. The signal and the noise have merged so completely, they're indistinguishable from the inside. This is not cause for despair. It's cause for precision. Because once you understand that your thoughts have a history, that they came from somewhere, shaped by forces that predate your adult self, something important becomes possible. You can start asking the question you couldn't ask before. Not what do I think, but where did this thought come from? Does it still apply? Did it ever apply to the person I actually am, or only to the person I was taught to be? That question, applied consistently, is one of the most powerful tools available to you. Not because it gives instant answers, because it creates distance. A small gap between you and the thought, between the observer and the content being observed. And in that gap, something becomes possible that wasn't before. Real choice. There's a concept in cognitive science called cognitive diffusion, developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes. The basic idea, we fuse with our thoughts. We don't have the thought, I'm not capable of this. We become it. It stops being a thought and starts being a fact about the world. Diffusion is the practice of separation. Seeing the thought as a thought, a mental event with a history, a source, an agenda, rather than as transparent truth. You don't have to believe everything you think. That sentence sounds simple. Most people have never actually applied it. Because most people have never questioned whether their thoughts are truly theirs, whether their beliefs were chosen, or whether the voice in their head is an accurate narrator or a deeply conditioned one. So here's what this section asks of you. Pick a belief you hold confidently, something about yourself or about what you're capable of, something that feels settled and obvious. And ask, where did this come from? Not to discard it, not to assume it's wrong, just to trace it, to see whether it was examined or simply absorbed, whether it still fits the life you're actually living, or whether it was calibrated for a context that no longer exists. You may find that some of what you're carrying was never really yours. And some of what could be yours, the possibilities, the self-conception you might have built, never had room to form, because the inherited material filled the space first. In the next section, we look at what happens when these inherited patterns meet the present moment. Why the same situations keep producing the same results. Why the loop keeps running even when you can see it. And why seeing it isn't always enough. The thought that just made you slightly uncomfortable, the one that surfaced when you asked where it came from, that one is worth returning to. Section 4. The loop that keeps you stuck. You've tried to change this before. It worked for a few days. Then something pulled you back. That pull has a name. It's not weakness. It's not lack of discipline. It's not some flaw that makes you different from people who seem to manage change more easily. It's a loop. A specific, identifiable, neurologically grounded loop. And it has been running reliably, efficiently, largely without your awareness, for longer than you've been trying to stop it. Understanding the loop doesn't automatically break it, but you cannot break something you haven't clearly seen. Most people who are stuck haven't seen it clearly. They felt it, suffered it, blamed themselves for it, but they haven't seen it for what it actually is. So that's what we do here. The loop has 4 components. They're not complicated, but their simplicity is deceptive. They operate so quickly, so far below conscious awareness, that by the time you notice what's happening, you're already 3 steps in. Here they are: trigger, thought, emotion, behavior. For steps, running in sequence, sometimes within seconds, producing the same output with the consistency of a machine. Something happens, in the world or inside your own mind. That's the trigger. It activates a thought, automatic, fast, often not fully formed. The thought generates an emotional response. The emotion drives behavior, and the behavior feeds back into the system in a way that makes the next cycle more likely. Round and round, with increasing efficiency, with decreasing visibility, until the loop isn't something you do, it's something you are. Let's make this concrete. Someone sends you a short, ambiguous message. No context, no tone, just words on a screen that could mean several things. The trigger is the message. The thought, instant, automatic, is an interpretation. They're annoyed with me. I did something wrong. This is going to be a difficult conversation. You didn't choose that interpretation. It arrived, generated by pattern recognition using the fastest available template. Whatever similar situation produced a strong emotional outcome in your past. The emotion follows immediately. Anxiety, defensiveness, low-grade dread, tension in the shoulders, a shift in breathing, a slight contraction. Then the behavior. Maybe you over-explain in your reply. Maybe you avoid responding entirely. Maybe you spend 2 hours running scenarios. Maybe you become short with someone else, and neither of you knows why. Then the confirmation. The reply comes back, and it was nothing. The conversation happens, and it's fine. But the system has already logged. Ambiguous message equals threat, and the template gets reinforced. The next ambiguous message triggers the same sequence, slightly faster, with slightly less evidence required. The loop tightens. Now here's what makes it so hard to interrupt. The loop doesn't feel like a loop. It feels like reality. The thought doesn't arrive labeled automatic interpretation based on past experience. It arrives as obvious truth. The emotion doesn't feel like a conditioned response. It feels like accurate information about right now. The behavior doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like a reasonable reaction. This is the central problem. The loop is self-concealing. It generates the experience of responding to reality while actually responding to a template of reality, one built in the past, calibrated for past conditions, applied wholesale to present circumstances that may be entirely different. You are reacting to a memory wearing the costume of the present moment. And then there's the reinforcement layer, where the loop becomes genuinely self-sustaining. Every time the loop runs, it gets stronger. Not because it's working, but because the brain doesn't reinforce what's effective. It reinforces what's familiar. The loop runs. You feel the emotion. You perform the behavior. The emotional intensity drops, not because the situation resolved, but because the behavior discharged the tension. That discharge registers as relief, as reward. The brain notes, loop ran, relief followed. File under, useful. So the next time the trigger appears, the loop fires faster, with less input required, with greater force, because it's been learned, practiced, and rewarded, not for its outcomes, but for its ability to move emotional energy. This is why the loop persists even when you know it's not serving you. Even when you've named it, discussed it, resolved to respond differently. Knowing is not the same as interrupting. Insight is not the same as change. The loop doesn't care what you know. It runs on a different track entirely. Think about a pattern in your own life you've already recognized. Maybe it's how you react to criticism. Maybe it's what happens when you feel ignored. Maybe it's the behavior that shows up when things start going well, and some part of you quietly begins to dismantle them. You've seen it before. You've resolved to respond differently, and then next time came, and the loop ran anyway. Not because you didn't mean it, because the trigger fired, the thought arrived, the emotion surged, and the behavior followed, all faster than your conscious intention could intervene. By the time the deliberate you arrived, the automated you had already responded. This is the timing problem at the heart of most failed attempts at change. We try to intervene at the behavior, at the end of the sequence, when the sequence has already completed. We're editing the output of a process we didn't catch while it was running. So where do you actually intervene? Not at the behavior, not at the emotion either. Both arrive too late. They're already downstream. The real intervention point is earlier, in the gap between the trigger and the thought. That gap feels non-existent in a well-practiced loop. But it's there, and it can be widened. Not through willpower, not through gritting your teeth and deciding to think differently, but through something more structural, more patient, and far more durable. We'll get there. But first, we need to understand the emotional layer precisely. Because emotion isn't just a step in the loop. It's the fuel. It's what gives the loop its power, its urgency, its sense of necessity. And most people carry a fundamental misunderstanding of what emotion actually is. That misunderstanding is costing them more than they know. In the next section, we go directly into the emotional system, not to manage it, not to suppress it, but to understand it well enough to stop being ambushed by it. The loop you just thought of? You've known about it for a while. The knowing wasn't enough. That's not a failure. That's information. Hold on to it. Section 5. Emotional hijacking. You knew the right thing to do. You didn't do it. Your emotions weren't ignoring your logic. They were running ahead of it. This has happened to every person who has ever lived. The moment where the reasonable, clearly correct response was visible. You could see it, articulate it, describe exactly what it looked like. And then something else happened instead. Something faster. Something louder. Something that felt completely justified in the moment, and that you may have spent hours or days quietly regretting. This is not a character issue. This is the emotional system doing exactly what it was built to do, in a context it was never built for. Understanding that difference is one of the most practically useful shifts you can make. The brain didn't develop all at once. It evolved in layers, newer structures building on top of older ones. The oldest parts, governing survival, threat detection, emotional response, are fast, efficient, and operate almost entirely outside conscious awareness. They were refined over millions of years in environments where speed of response was the difference between survival and death. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, planning, and deliberate thought, came later. And it's extraordinary, but it's also slow, metabolically expensive. And when it conflicts with the older system has a significant structural advantage. This is what's happening when you later say I lost control or I wasn't myself. The threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, deep in the brain's limbic region, identified something as a threat, initiated a stress response, and mobilized the body for action. All before the prefrontal cortex had finished processing what was actually happening. The emotional response didn't interrupt your thinking. It preceded it. The amygdala's job is pattern recognition under urgency. It scans incoming information continuously at extraordinary speed, looking for matches to stored threat templates, built from things that hurt, things that frightened, things that produced strong emotional outcomes in the past. When it finds a match, or even a partial match, it acts. Immediately, stress hormones release, heart rate climbs, muscles prime, attention narrows. The system is preparing you to fight, flee, or freeze. And here is the critical detail. The amygdala does not wait for confirmation. It acts on resemblance, on partial information. It would rather fire incorrectly 100 times than miss a real threat once. In an environment where threats were physical and immediate, that bias kept you alive. In the environment most of us actually live in, where threats are social, professional, relational, that same bias creates a serious problem. The system calibrated to detect predators is now evaluating emails, tone of voice, perceived slights, ambiguous silences, and it's bringing the same urgency, the same physical mobilization to all of it. Your nervous system doesn't always distinguish between a genuine threat and a triggering resemblance to one. And here's what makes it considerably worse. The emotional response doesn't just influence behavior. It influences perception. When the stress response activates, attention narrows. Useful in a genuine emergency. But in a charged moment, it means you are literally perceiving less of the situation than you would in a calm state. You are working with less information while feeling most certain about your conclusions. The anger, the anxiety, the hurt, these don't just color your interpretation. They actively filter what you can take in. Information that contradicts the emotional narrative becomes harder to register. Information that confirms it becomes louder. The world, in that moment, genuinely looks different than it would 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later. And then you make decisions from that filtered, narrowed state. Decisions with real consequences in your relationships, your work, your patterns. This is emotional hijacking, not as metaphor, as a precise neurological description. The trigger fires, the automatic thought arrives, the emotion activates. And now the loop isn't just cognitive, it's physical. Your body is involved. Your perception is altered. The reasonable response you knew was available? Still there. But it's behind a door that just got significantly harder to open. This is why talking yourself through it in the moment so rarely works. You're trying to use clear reasoning, a resource the emotional state has partially taken offline. It's not that you can't think. It's that the quality and range of your thinking is compromised in ways you don't notice until afterward. Afterward, when the stress hormones have cleared and the prefrontal cortex is fully back online, the right response seems obvious. Your reaction looks disproportionate. You wonder why you couldn't see it differently. Because in that moment, you genuinely couldn't. The system running wasn't designed for nuance. It was designed for speed. Now, here's the shift that changes how people relate to all of this. Emotion is not the enemy of good thinking. It's information. Before the hijacking fully activates, before the intensity distorts everything, emotion is a sophisticated signal system. Fear says, something here warrants attention. Anger says, a boundary has been crossed. Sadness says, something meaningful has been lost. Anxiety says, there's uncertainty ahead that matters to you. These aren't irrational responses. They're data, often accurate data. The problem isn't the emotion. The problem is when the signal becomes the action without any processing in between. When fear doesn't just alert you, it makes the decision. When anger doesn't just flag the boundary, it determines the response. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. The goal is to restore the gap between signal and action, to let emotion inform your thinking rather than replace it. That gap, small, recoverable, trainable, is where everything changes. So how do you work with a system that's faster than your awareness? Not by trying to outrun it. Not by suppression, which tends to compress emotional energy and release it elsewhere. Later, harder, at worse timing. The first move is recognition. Not in real time. That comes with practice. In retrospect, which is where almost everyone starts. You look back at a moment where the hijacking happened. You trace the sequence. You identify the trigger, the thought, the physical response, the behavior. You notice the speed. You notice what you were perceiving and what you weren't. You notice the gap between what the situation actually contained and what the emotional state made it feel like. Without judgment. This isn't about finding fault with yourself for reacting. It's about building a map. An honest map of how your particular emotional system works, what activates it, how it moves through you, what it produces. Because you cannot interrupt a process you haven't mapped. And you cannot map a process you're defending against seeing. Over time, through repeated honest observation, something shifts. Recognition moves earlier in the sequence. What you once only saw in retrospect, you begin to catch closer to the moment. The physical signals, tension, the shift in breathing, the particular quality of contracted attention become recognizable sooner. And with earlier recognition comes a slightly wider gap. Not wide enough to reason your way through. Not at first, but wide enough to pause. Wide enough not to act immediately. Wide enough to introduce a question where there used to be only an automatic response. That pause is not a small thing. That pause is, in many ways, the entire project. In the next section, we look at the voice that runs through all of this. The internal narrator that's been interpreting your triggers, reinforcing your loops, and maintaining your self-image since before you can remember. Because the emotional system and the inner voice aren't separate. They feed each other. And understanding that relationship opens up something none of the previous sections quite reaches. The possibility of changing not just what you do, but what you experience yourself to be. Think about the last time the hijacking happened. Don't relive it. Just locate the moment the sequence became irreversible. That moment is earlier than you think. And now, for the first time, you know what to look for. Section 6. The Inner Voice Problem. Your inner voice is not you. It's a habit. And like all habits, it can be interrupted. That sentence just landed in one of two ways. Either it created a small release, a maybe that's true, or it triggered an immediate, quiet objection. No, my thoughts are mine. I know my own mind. Notice which one happened. Because either way, that reaction is the inner voice doing exactly what it always does. Responding automatically, defending its position, asserting its authority over the very conversation about whether it has that authority. That's not a coincidence. That's the mechanism. Everyone has an ongoing internal monologue, a continuous, largely automatic stream of commentary, interpretation, and narration that runs through the mind during most of waking life. It has opinions about everything. What people meant by what they said, what you should do next, what you should have done differently, who you are, what you're worth, whether you're doing enough, whether you're too much. It is relentless. It is fast. And for most people, it is almost entirely unquestioned. Not because they've examined it and found it trustworthy, because it speaks in first person. It uses the word I. It arrives with the texture of thought itself, seamless, intimate, interior, in a way that makes it feel indistinguishable from the self doing the thinking. But the inner voice is not the self. It's a function of the self. Automated, historically conditioned, running on patterns established long before you had the tools to evaluate them. Here's a way to see this clearly. Imagine you hired an assistant years ago. You gave them instructions based on your life as it was then, your fears, your priorities, what you needed protection from, what you needed encouragement toward. That assistant has been working diligently ever since, interpreting everything through the lens of those original instructions. But here's the problem. You never updated the instructions because you forgot you gave them. The assistant's voice became so familiar, so constant, so interior, that you stopped experiencing it as an assistant and started experiencing it as yourself. That's the inner voice, running on old instructions, reporting to a version of you that may no longer exist, and doing so with complete conviction in the most personal register imaginable. The inner voice performs 3 core functions, and each one shapes your experience in ways that stay invisible until they're pointed out. The first is interpretation. It doesn't observe what happens. It immediately explains it. Someone walks past you without acknowledging you. Before the moment has fully registered, the voice has already generated a story. They're ignoring me. I did something wrong. I'm not important to them. That interpretation depends entirely on the voice's existing templates, its history, its conditioning, its bias towards certain kinds of meaning. The interpretation feels like perception. It isn't. It's inference, delivered at the speed of perception, wearing perception's clothes. The second is evaluation. The inner voice runs a constant assessment of how you're doing. Not neutrally, it has a position. Depending on its conditioning, it may be systematically harsh, measuring you against a standard that moves whenever you approach it, or defensively positive, explaining away difficulties, protecting a self-image that can't survive honest scrutiny. Most commonly, it oscillates between both, consistent mainly in its lack of neutrality. The third is prediction. It constantly generates forecasts about how things will go, what you're capable of, what's worth trying. These predictions feel like reasonable assessments. They're actually pattern extrapolations, projections of past experience onto future possibility, dressed as objective probability. When the voice says this won't work or I'm not someone who can do that, it's not analyzing the future. It's remembering the past and presenting that memory as a fact about what's coming. Now here's the shift that tends to change everything. You are not your inner voice. You are the one who can hear it. That distinction, simple to state, genuinely difficult to internalize, is the foundation of what researchers call the observer self. The part of your awareness that can notice thoughts without being those thoughts, that can hear the voice without automatically endorsing it, that can create, however briefly, separation between the commentary and the one receiving it. Most people have experienced this accidentally. A moment of unusual clarity where you caught yourself mid-thought and recognized it as a thought. A mental event with a particular flavor and history, rather than transparent truth. A moment where the voice said something and you heard it, almost from a slight distance, and thought, "That's interesting. Is that actually true?" That gap isn't a trick. It's not a technique. It's a capacity that already exists in you. The question is whether you can access it consistently, rather than only by accident. Mindfulness traditions have described this practice for thousands of years. Cognitive behavioral therapy works directly with the relationship between thoughts and the conclusions drawn from them. Acceptance and commitment therapy focuses on diffusion, learning to hold thoughts as thoughts rather than facts. What all of these share is the same foundational recognition. The content of the inner voice is not the measure of reality. It's a perspective, historically conditioned, automatically generated, often biased. It can be observed, questioned, and related to differently. Not eliminated, not argued into silence. Related to differently, because the goal is not to stop the voice. The voice will run, that's what it does. The goal is to shift your relationship to it, from automatic endorsement to curious observation. From this is what's true to this is what the voice is saying right now. Interesting. Let me look at that. That shift changes everything downstream. When the voice says you're going to fail at this, instead of that landing as fact and generating the avoidance and self-doubt that follow from believing it, you have a moment, small, usable, in which to ask, is this true? What is this based on? Is this the voice describing reality, or the voice extrapolating from a past that doesn't necessarily predict this situation? You don't always have to answer fully. Sometimes just asking is enough. The question disrupts the automatic endorsement, and disrupting the endorsement disrupts everything that follows from it. This isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel transformative in the moment, but applied consistently across the loops and patterns and emotional responses we've been tracing, it compounds. It builds. It gradually shifts the center of gravity from automatic reaction to something that genuinely deserves the name choice. One more thing worth naming. For many people, the inner voice carries a quality of companionship. It's always there, familiar. Even when it's harsh, there's something almost comforting about its consistency. The idea of stepping back from it, not taking it at its word, can feel like losing something, like becoming less yourself. But think about what you'd actually be losing. Not the capacity for thought, not your values, your perspective, your genuine responses. Just the automatic, unexamined authority of a voice running on instructions you never consciously approved, interpreting your present through the lens of a past that may no longer apply. What you'd be gaining, gradually, imperfectly, but genuinely, is the capacity to really think, to arrive at perspectives that are actually yours, formed through examination rather than inherited through repetition. That's not losing yourself. That's finding the version of yourself that's been there all along, beneath the noise. In the next section, we look at the mechanism through which all of this operates moment to moment. Attention, where it goes, what it amplifies, what it creates. Because the inner voice doesn't just comment on your experience. It directs your focus. And your focus, more than almost any other variable, determines what your reality actually consists of. The voice that's been commenting on this section, notice it. Not to judge what it's saying, just to notice it's there, separate from you, observable. That noticing, right now, is exactly what we've been talking about. Section 7. The attention economy inside your head. Your attention is being spent right now. The question is whether you're the one spending it. Not metaphorically, literally. At this exact moment, your brain is selecting what to amplify, what to suppress, what to hold in awareness, and what to push to the edges. This is happening continuously, automatically, with enormous consequences for what you experience, what you remember, and what becomes possible for you. Attention is not passive. It doesn't simply notice what's there. It is an active, constructive process that shapes what is there for you, in your reality, in the world as you move through it. Most people treat attention as a byproduct, something that naturally follows the interesting thing, the loud thing, the emotionally charged thing. And it does follow those things automatically, by default, in the absence of anything more deliberate. But that default is not neutral. It has been shaped by the same conditioning, the same loops, the same inner voice we've been tracing throughout this entire audiobook. Left on that default, attention doesn't serve you. It serves the pattern. Here's the principle, stated as precisely as possible. What you attend to determines what you perceive. What you perceive determines what you think. What you think determines what you feel. What you feel determines what you do. And what you do, repeated over time, determines who you become. Attention is not one variable among many. It is the first variable, the upstream variable. Change it deliberately and consistently, and everything downstream changes with it. The brain cannot process everything equally. The volume of incoming information is too vast. So it selects. It prioritizes. It amplifies certain signals and suppresses others based on what it has learned to treat as relevant, threatening, or meaningful. And what it learned to treat as relevant was, you know this now, determined largely by history, by conditioning, by patterns established before you had any conscious input into the process. Which means for most people, the brain's attentional priorities aren't their own priorities. They're the priorities of an earlier self, operating in an earlier context, responding to pressures that may no longer apply. There's a well-documented phenomenon in psychology called the negativity bias. The brain weights negative information more heavily than positive information of equivalent intensity. Bad events register more strongly than good ones. Threats capture attention faster than opportunities. Criticism lands harder and lingers longer than praise. This isn't a personality flaw. It's a species-wide feature, the product of an evolutionary environment where missing a threat was far more costly than missing a reward. The brain that stayed alert to danger survived. The one that relaxed into the good moments sometimes didn't. So the architecture was built toward vigilance, toward noticing what's wrong, what's missing, what could go badly. In the environment it was designed for, this was adaptive. In the environment most of us actually inhabit, where threats are rarely physical and opportunities are frequently abundant, the same bias becomes a systematic distortion of reality. By default, you are running a brain better at finding problems than possibilities, better at registering what went wrong than what went right, better at attending to how far you are from where you want to be than to how far you've already come. This is not pessimism. This is architecture, and architecture can be worked with. Here's what that actually looks like. Two people give the same presentation. The room is engaged, the feedback largely positive. Afterward, one person replays the 3 moments that felt slightly off, a hesitation in delivery, a question they didn't answer cleanly, a look on someone's face that might have indicated skepticism. The other is thinking about the engagement in the room, the moments that landed, the relationship that moved forward, the evidence that the work was effective. Same meeting, same information. Radically different experiences, different memories, different conclusions about themselves, and different emotional states going into the next day. The difference isn't optimism versus pessimism as fixed personality traits. It's attentional allocation, where each person's focus went, automatically or deliberately, in the hours after the event. And attentional allocation, unlike personality, is trainable. Now bring this closer to home. Think about a recurring situation where you consistently feel stuck. Hold it for a moment and ask, what does your attention go to in that situation? What does it find first? What does it keep returning to? For most people, in their stuck areas, the answer is remarkably consistent. Attention goes to the evidence of the problem, the distance remaining, the past failures that seem to predict future ones, the voices, internal and remembered, that confirm the stuck story. And here's what sustained attention does. It builds structure, denser neural connections, faster, more automatic pathways. The stuck story becomes easier to access, more readily available, more likely to be the first frame your mind reaches for next time. Attention doesn't just reflect reality. It participates in constructing it. What you focus on, you reinforce. What you reinforce becomes more real, not in the objective sense, but in the deeply practical sense of what your brain makes available to you, what it treats as relevant, what it uses to filter and predict. There's a further dimension here that tends to be underappreciated. Attention doesn't just shape perception in the moment. It shapes memory. And memory is the raw material of every pattern, loop, and default response that runs your life. What you attend to gets encoded more strongly. The events you keep returning to, the mistakes you keep replaying, the moments of failure or hurt you keep running through. Through that repeated attention, you are making them structurally more significant in your brain than they were when they first occurred. You are, in a very literal sense, building your past. Not the events themselves, those are fixed, but their weight, their meaning, their influence on how you see yourself and what you expect. All of it is being actively constructed, moment by moment, by where your attention goes and how long it stays. That's not comfortable, but it's useful, because it means the reverse is also true. Deliberate attention, practiced, directed toward what you want to amplify rather than what the default system prioritizes, changes the structure. Slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. This is not positive thinking in the shallow sense. It is not the instruction to ignore problems or pretend difficulties don't exist. The goal isn't to look away from difficulty. It's to stop rehearsing the story of difficulty at the expense of your capacity to actually respond to it. There's a crucial distinction here. Attending to a problem in order to solve it is useful. Attending to a problem in order to rehearse how bad it is, how stuck you are, how this always happens. That is attention working directly against you. That is the default system running unchecked, consuming your primary cognitive resource in the service of reinforcing the pattern. So in practice, what does deliberate attention actually look like? It starts with noticing. Where does your attention go without your direction? What does it amplify? What does it keep returning to? Not judging it, just seeing it clearly. From that noticing, a question becomes possible. What else is here? What is this situation also containing that I'm not currently looking at? What would I notice if I weren't looking through this particular lens? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're practical cognitive moves. They widen the aperture. They introduce information the default system was filtering out. And practiced consistently, they begin to shift where attention goes first, which shifts what gets encoded, which shifts the memory, which shifts the pattern, which shifts the loop. From the top of the sequence, where change is most durable. In the next section, we move from observation to intervention. Because everything we've covered, the autopilot, the loops, the emotional hijacking, the inner voice, the attentional default, has all been preparation for one practical question. What do you actually do in the moment when you catch it happening? That question has a real answer, not an inspiring one. A specific, neurologically grounded, practically applicable answer that works not because it sounds good, but because it fits the architecture of what's actually going on. Notice what your attention did with this section, where it went readily, where it resisted. That's not random. That's the map of your current attentional default. And now you can see it. Section 8. Interrupting the pattern in real time. The thought will come. It always does. What changes is the half second after it. Everything in this audiobook has been building toward this section. Not because what came before was prologue. It wasn't. Understanding the autopilot, the loop, the emotional system, the inner voice, the attentional default, all of that is doing real work. It's changing how you relate to your own mind. That matters on its own. But understanding without application is a sophisticated way of staying exactly where you are. At some point, not when conditions are perfect, not when you feel ready, the question has to become practical. What do you actually do? Not in theory, not in retrospect. In the moment, when the trigger has fired, when the automatic thought is arriving, when the emotional charge is building and the familiar behavior is right there, well-worn, available, requiring nothing from you except the usual surrender. What happens in that half second? First, a necessary correction to how most people frame this. The goal is not to stop the thought from arriving. That's not possible. Suppression tends to increase the frequency and intensity of suppressed content. Telling yourself not to think about something is one of the most reliable ways to think about it. The thought is going to come. The trigger is going to fire. The emotional response is going to initiate. None of that is the problem. What you're working with is what happens next. In the uninterrupted loop, what happens next is automatic. The thought arrives, it's treated as true, the emotion escalates, the behavior follows. The sequence completes in seconds, and the conscious mind arrives afterward to narrate it as a choice. The intervention isn't before the sequence. It's inside it. In the gap, that small, expandable, trainable space between trigger and response, where something other than the automatic completion becomes possible. So how do you access that gap when you're already inside the activation? Not through reasoning alone, not in a moment of high emotional intensity. We established this in the section on hijacking. The prefrontal cortex is partially offline when the stress response is running at full force. Trying to think your way through a fully activated emotional state is like trying to read in a room that's on fire. The capacity is there. The conditions aren't. What the nervous system responds to, even under activation, is the body. The stress response is a physical state. It lives in the body before it lives in the mind. The elevated heart rate, the muscle tension, the shift in breathing, these aren't symptoms of the emotional response. They are the emotional response at the physical level, and they can be influenced directly in ways the thought cannot. The fastest, most reliable intervention point is the breath, not as a wellness metaphor, as a direct line into the autonomic nervous system, specifically the parasympathetic branch, which governs the calming response. A slow, deliberate exhale, longer than the inhale, activates the vagus nerve, signals the nervous system to begin downregulating the threat response, and creates measurable physiological change within seconds. That's the gap, not a thought, a breath. The moment of physical interruption that gives the higher cognitive functions enough space to come back online. But be precise about what this is and isn't. The breath is not a solution. It's an opening. What you do with that opening is the actual work. And the work, in the moment, follows a simple sequence. Notice, something is happening. The body registered it before the mind caught up. Tension somewhere, a shift in breathing, a particular quality of contracted alertness. You don't need to know exactly what triggered it. You just need to notice the system has engaged. Name, silently, without drama. There's anxiety here. There's anger here. There's the familiar feeling that precedes the familiar behavior. Naming the emotional state, not narrating why it's justified, just naming it, has a documented effect on intensity. Labeling activates the prefrontal cortex and slightly reduces amygdala activation. The act of naming creates distance. Small, but enough to work with. Pause. This is where the breath comes in. Not visibly, not in a way that requires explanation to whoever's in the room. Just the internal decision not to act immediately. To let the first wave pass without letting it dictate the response. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, long enough for the initial intensity to peak and begin to drop. Choose from that slightly wider gap, with emotional intensity slightly reduced and cognitive capacity slightly more available. A question becomes possible that wasn't there 2 seconds ago. What do I actually want to happen here? What response serves the situation rather than the pattern? Not a full analysis. Just a single orienting question pointing the next action towards something you chose rather than something the loop chose for you. Now, the honest qualification. Because this section would be failing you without it. This does not work perfectly. Not at first. Not under high activation. Not in situations closely matching your most established loops. The ones with the deepest grooves, the strongest charge, the longest history. The first time you try to interrupt a well-established pattern in real time, you will often fail. You'll notice you're in the loop and complete it anyway. That's not failure in the meaningful sense. That's the beginning of practice. Because you noticed. And noticing, even at the tail end of the sequence, even after the behavior has already occurred, that noticing is further upstream than you were before. Further upstream is the direction of change. The second time, you might catch it slightly earlier. The third time, earlier still. The gap that starts as something you find only in retrospect gradually becomes something you can access in the moment. First in low-intensity situations, then moderate ones, then eventually in the high-charge situations where you most need it. It's not linear. There will be regressions, moments where the loop runs exactly as it always did, and you watch it happen with a familiar combination of frustration and recognition. That's not evidence the process isn't working. It's evidence that the loop is well established, which you already knew, and the new pattern is still being built. You're not suppressing the old pathway. You're building a new one alongside it. And new pathways become faster and more automatic through exactly the same mechanism that made the old ones fast and automatic. Repetition in context over time. There's one more dimension worth naming, because it extends well beyond the acute moment. The gap doesn't only exist inside high activation situations. It exists in the small moments throughout every day. The micro decisions, the habitual responses, the automatic interpretations that run so quietly, they barely register as events at all. The story you tell yourself about why someone didn't reply. The self-assessment that runs after a small mistake. The assumption you form before a conversation that shapes how you walk into it. These aren't dramatic moments, but they are the constant background texture of your cognitive life. In aggregate, they may matter more than the high-stakes loops, because they are the unbroken, daily running of the system. The low-grade hum that accumulates, day by day, into the experience of being you. Interrupting the pattern isn't just about the big moments. It's about developing a different relationship with the small ones. A slightly more deliberate, slightly less automatic way of moving through your own mind. Not perfect, not exhausting, not vigilance turned into anxiety. Just a quality of presence, a small, sustainable, gradually increasing willingness to catch the automatic before it becomes the inevitable. Every time you successfully interrupt the pattern, even briefly, even in a situation that barely matters, you are doing something neurologically significant. You are activating the prefrontal cortex in response to a cue that previously bypassed it. You are creating a moment of deliberate processing where there used to be only automatic response. You are, literally, beginning to wire something new. Fragile at first, requiring reinforcement, but real. And real is where everything starts. In the next section, we go deeper, because interrupting the pattern addresses the moment of firing. But beneath the moments is a layer that governs all of them: identity. The story you hold about who you are, what you're like, what you're capable of, and what you can expect from yourself. That story isn't just a belief. It's a self-fulfilling architecture. And changing it is both more fundamental and more possible than most people have been told. The next time something activates you, even something small, try just naming it. Not out loud. Internally. One word. The emotion, not the story. Notice what that single act does to the intensity. That's the gap. That's what we've been talking about all along. Section 9. Rewriting the default. You're not a fixed thing. You're a narrative that's been running on the same draft for years. That framing might feel uncomfortable, or it might feel like relief. Often it's both at once. The discomfort of realizing that what felt solid and settled is more fluid than you thought, and the relief of realizing that fluid things can move. Because if identity is fixed, if who you are is as unchangeable as your height or your blood type, then the patterns we've been tracing are simply who you are. The loops are you. The automatic responses are you. The inner voice's harshest verdicts are you. And you are stuck with them, permanently, the way you're stuck with your bone structure. But that's not what identity is. That's not what the evidence shows. And it's not what honest observation of your own experience confirms. Identity is a story. Specifically, it's the brain's construction of a coherent, persistent self moving through time, making sense of experience, maintaining a stable enough picture of who this person is that decisions can be made, relationships maintained, the future navigated with some consistency. That story is necessary. Without some version of it, coherent functioning isn't possible. But necessary doesn't mean accurate. And necessary doesn't mean the draft currently running is the best available, or the truest, or the one most aligned with who you actually are and what you're actually capable of. Here's how the identity story gets written. It starts early. The early environment provides the raw material. What kind of person you are, what you're good at, what you struggle with, what to expect from yourself and others. These early characterizations get encoded during a period of maximum neurological receptivity and minimum critical evaluation. But the story doesn't get written once. It gets continuously reinforced. Every experience you have is filtered through the existing identity narrative, interpreted in ways that confirm it, and filed as new evidence. This is the confirmation bias of the self. The brain, having established a working model of who you are, preferentially attends to information that fits the model and discounts what doesn't. Not through deliberate dishonesty, through automatic processing. Through the same efficiency-driven pattern recognition governing every other aspect of cognition. If the story says I'm someone who doesn't follow through, every unfinished project becomes evidence, filed and stored. Every completed project gets minimized, explained away, attributed to external factors. The model stays intact. The brain gets what it's optimized for: predictability and coherence. If the story says I'm not creative, every creative failure confirms it. Every creative success becomes a fluke, not really representative. The identity holds. The story protects itself, not maliciously, mechanically, the way all self-reinforcing systems do. And here's what makes this genuinely consequential. The identity story doesn't just influence how you interpret your past. It directly shapes what you attempt in the future, what you think is available to you, what you believe is worth trying, what you let yourself want. Researchers studying self-concept and behavior have consistently found that people act in ways consistent with their self-image, even when acting differently would produce better outcomes. The pull toward identity-consistent behavior is powerful enough to override motivation, instruction, and evidence. It operates below the level of conscious decision-making, as a background governor on what actions are even considered possible. This is why information and motivation alone don't create lasting change. You can know exactly what to do. You can want it genuinely. You can be entirely convinced of its value, and still find something pulling you back, not quite to the old behavior, but to the old sense of self that the new behavior contradicts. The behavior change didn't reach deep enough. It didn't touch the story generating the behavior in the first place. So what does actually rewriting the story look like? First, what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like affirmations. Repeating positive statements in direct contradiction to what the existing identity story holds tends to produce one of two outcomes. Either ineffectiveness, because the gap between the stated belief and the felt sense of self is too large for the statement to register as credible, or defensive activation, where the brain generates counter-evidence to protect the existing model. Research has found that for people with low self-esteem, strong positive affirmations can actually worsen mood. The system rejects the input. It doesn't look like wholesale reinvention either. Deciding to just be different through an act of will runs into the same wall. The new identity isn't supported by anything structural yet. No history, no evidence, no neural infrastructure. It's a claim without a foundation, and claims without foundations collapse under pressure. What actually works is more gradual, more precise, and in many ways more interesting. It starts with the language of the story. The identity story is told in language, the inner voice we examined in Section 6. And the specific words used matter more than most people recognize. There's a meaningful difference between "I failed at that" and "I'm a failure." Between "I struggled with this" and "I'm someone who can't handle this." Between "I didn't do that well" and "I'm not capable of doing that well." The first version in each pair describes an event. The second describes an identity, and the brain processes them differently. Identity statements activate self-concept structures more directly, get encoded more deeply, and have more durable effects on subsequent behavior than event descriptions. Most people's inner voice runs heavily on identity language. "I always do this. I never manage to. I'm the kind of person who. I'm not someone who." Every repetition deepens the groove of the story it's telling. The first rewrite is simple: move from identity language to event language. Not as denial, not as pretense the event didn't happen, as precision. What occurred was an event. The conclusion that it proves something fixed and permanent about you. That's an interpretation. And interpretations can be updated. The second element is evidence. The existing story has evidence behind it. The brain has been selectively collecting it for years. The goal isn't to pretend that evidence doesn't exist. The goal is to audit the collection process. Because the collection has been biased. You know this now. The filing system has been systematically incomplete, capturing evidence that confirms the story, minimizing evidence of its exceptions. So the rewrite involves deliberately locating the exceptions, not to construct a false counter-narrative, to create a more accurate one. You believe you're someone who doesn't follow through? When have you followed through? Not perfectly. Perfection isn't the standard. When have you sustained effort, completed something, kept a commitment under conditions that made it genuinely difficult? That evidence exists. It has been minimized, explained away, treated as unrepresentative. Find it. Look at it directly. Let it be as real as the evidence running in the other direction. This is not positive thinking. This is accurate thinking, deliberately, effortfully accurate, in a system that has been running an inaccurate story for a long time. The third element is behavioral. Because the story isn't only told in words, it's told in actions. Every time you behave in accordance with the existing identity story, you give it new evidence. Every time you behave in a way that slightly contradicts it, even in a small situation, even imperfectly, you introduce new data into the system. This is where the identity rewrite connects directly to the pattern interruption from the previous section. Each successful interruption of an automatic pattern isn't just a behavioral event. It's an identity event. Small, real evidence, filed in the system, that the story of who you are has more flexibility than the current draft suggests. The person who catches the loop and pauses, even briefly, is slightly different from the person who didn't catch it. Not dramatically, but measurably. A new data point has been filed. A small exception to the old story has been created. Stack enough exceptions, and the story has to update. Not all at once, not without resistance, but incrementally, in the direction of the evidence you're generating. This is identity change as it actually works, not through declaration, not through dramatic reinvention, but through the slow, consistent accumulation of behavioral evidence that the story was wrong about you, or at least that it was incomplete. One more thing worth naming directly, because it tends to surface at exactly this point in the process. As the old identity story loosens, as you begin to question its authority, to act in ways that contradict it, there is often a period of disorientation, a feeling of not quite knowing who you are, the usual certainties feeling less certain, the familiar scaffolding becoming less stable. This is not a sign something has gone wrong. This is what change from the inside feels like at the level of identity. The old structure is shifting. The new one isn't fully built yet. There's a period of in-between that feels unsettled in a way that's hard to name. Not painful exactly, but unmoored. Sit with it. Not passively, not indefinitely, but with the recognition that disorientation at this level is a sign of movement, not of damage. The uncertainty you feel is the space between the old story and the new one. And in that space, more than at any other point, you have genuine input into what gets written next. In the next section, we address the question that follows naturally from everything covered here. If change at the identity level is real but gradual, if pattern interruption requires practice, if building new defaults takes time, how do you build an environment that supports all of that? Because individual moments of awareness are necessary but not sufficient. The context in which those moments happen either makes them more likely or quietly drains the energy required to produce them. The answer is not more willpower. You know that now. The answer is design. The story you've been telling about yourself. Notice whatever version of it surfaced during this section. Not to judge it, just to see it as a story, with a history, with gaps, with a draft status that is not the same as a final verdict. Section 10. Building systems that don't require willpower. The people who seem most disciplined aren't trying harder than you. They've arranged things so they don't have to. Research on self-regulation consistently shows that highly disciplined people don't report greater willpower or stronger self-control. What they report, and what behavioral analysis confirms, is that they encounter fewer situations requiring self-control in the first place. Not because their lives are easier, because their environments are more deliberately arranged. They are not stronger. They are smarter about context. Willpower is real. It's associated with the prefrontal cortex, the same region we've tracked throughout this audiobook. It requires metabolic energy. It depletes with use. It diminishes across a day, under stress, under sleep deprivation, under emotional activation. The decision you made easily at 9 in the morning is genuinely harder at 9 in the evening. Not because you've become weaker, but because the neural resource required to override the default has been partially consumed by everything that came before. Just try harder is not just ineffective. It's structurally misconceived. It treats a finite physiological resource as a moral quality improvable through desire alone. There's a better approach. It doesn't require more strength. It requires more intelligence about design. Behavior is the product of person plus environment, not person alone. Change the environment, and you often change the behavior, without changing anything about the person's internal state at all. The environment is always doing something to you. The only question is whether it's doing something deliberate or something accidental. Whether it was arranged by you for your actual goals, or arranged by default, by whoever and whatever happened to shape your surroundings before you thought carefully about what you needed from them. Every behavior exists in a context. That context contains cues, signals the brain has learned to associate with particular responses, triggering the habit loop without conscious initiation. This is why you reach for your phone when you sit in a particular chair, why you eat more when food is visible, why you exercise more easily when your clothes are already laid out. The cues in your environment are running your behavior more than you know, and most of those cues were never chosen. They accumulated. Deliberate environment design operates on two levers, making desired behavior easier and making undesired behavior harder. Not impossible, friction, not elimination. Because the brain is exquisitely sensitive to effort. Small increases in difficulty produce disproportionate decreases in behavior. Put the book on the pillow. Put the phone in another room. The battle over the cookie is decided when you decide what goes in the cupboard, not when hunger arrives. Every decision sitting between you and the behavior you want is friction. Every piece of friction is a point where the default gains advantage. You're not fighting your tendencies with these moves. You're redesigning the terrain so your tendencies work in your favor. And it goes deeper than behavior. Environments reinforce identities. The context you're in sends continuous signals about who you are and what people like you do. The behavioral standard of your immediate environment becomes, over time, a reference point for your own. Placing yourself in contexts where the behavior you want is normal, where the people around you are already doing it, removes much of the friction willpower is usually asked to overcome. You are not swimming against the current. You are choosing a different river. This is the integration point. The autopilot runs on environmental cues. Design the environment, shape the autopilot. The loop is triggered by context. Change the context, alter the trigger. The inner voice is influenced by what you consistently expose yourself to. The identity story is written, in part, by the environments you inhabit and the people you spend time with. Internal and external, working together. The system addressed at every level it actually operates. Look at your environment right now. One thing in it is pulling you toward a pattern you'd rather not be running. You already know which thing it is. That's where you start. Section 11. What control actually means. The goal was never to silence your mind. It was to stop being surprised by it. We began with a disruption, the suggestion that the driver's seat isn't quite what it feels like. That beneath deliberate thought and reasoned decision, a vast automated system is running. Faster than awareness, older than intention, shaped by forces that predate your adult self by years, sometimes decades. That disruption was necessary. You cannot work skillfully with a system you believe you're already managing. Now you've seen it clearly. You've traced the autopilot, mapped the loop, understood the emotional system and its speed, examined the inner voice and its history, followed attention and what it builds, practiced interruption in real time, questioned the identity story, and understood why environment does more behavioral work than willpower ever could. So let's be precise about what control actually means. Control is not domination. The image most people carry, the rational mind standing over the emotional mind, willpower overriding impulse, the higher self winning a continuous battle against the lower, is not only inaccurate, it's counterproductive. You cannot be at war with yourself and at peace at the same time. The automatic system is not your enemy. It is you, an older, faster, less flexible version of you, built from your experience, running in service of your survival, however poorly calibrated to your current life. What you're developing is not the capacity to overpower that system. It's the capacity to work with it. There's a word that captures this more precisely than control does. Fluency. Fluency in a language means you don't have to think about the grammar. It runs automatically. You're not controlling it. You're using it. What you're building is fluency with your own mind, not the absence of automatic processes. Those will always be there, but a relationship with them fluid enough that you're no longer constantly surprised, no longer constantly spending finite, deliberate resources managing the gap between what you intend and what actually happens. It feels quieter than you might expect, not silent. The thoughts still come. The emotions still move through. The inner voice still has things to say, but underneath the movement, there's something steadier, something not rattled by every automatic thought, not hijacked by every emotional charge, not detachment, presence, the capacity to be fully in your experience without being entirely at the mercy of it. This is not a finished state. There is no finished state. The loops resurface under stress. The inner voice gets loud again in difficult seasons. The attentional default reasserts itself when you're depleted. That is not failure. That is the nature of working with a living system under changing conditions. What changes over time is not that the challenges disappear. It's that the recovery is faster. The recognition comes earlier. The space between trigger and response, which started as something you could only locate in retrospect, gradually becomes something you can access in the moment. Not always, not perfectly, but more than before. And more than before is the whole measure. You are not the contents of your mind. You are the awareness in which those contents arise. The thoughts are events in your awareness. The emotions are signals passing through. The inner voice is a function you have, not a fact about what you are. That awareness is what this entire audiobook has been pointing toward. Not as something you have to build from nothing, as something you already have, that you've always had, that you're now beginning to use deliberately. The system is visible. The patterns are named. The mechanisms are understood. What happens next is yours, not the automatic version, not what the old patterns would produce left unexamined. The deliberate version, the one that knows the difference between the voice and the self, the one that can feel the activation and choose the response. The one that is writing, slowly and honestly, a truer story about who it is and what it's capable of. This is not the end of the work. It's the end of not knowing where to start.